The axe fell from Cordelia's trembling hands as her knees buckled against the oak stump. Sweat dripped from her bare shoulders, mixing with the sawdust that clung to her torn chemise. The sun blazed mercilessly overhead as she collapsed forward, her vision blurring from exhaustion and the relentless heat of the Wyoming summer. "Let me shoulder this with you," came a deep voice from behind her. Maverick Holloway dismounted his stallion in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling against the hard-packed earth. He'd been riding the boundary of his ranch when he spotted the woman through the grove of cottonwoods, working alone like a woman possessed. Her auburn hair had escaped its pins hours ago, cascading down her back in damp tendrils, and her skirts were hitched up past her knees in a way that would have scandalized the church ladies in town. But Maverick wasn't thinking about propriety as he knelt beside her crumpled form. He was thinking about the calluses on her palms and the determination that had driven her to work herself into the ground. "Ma'am." He touched her shoulder gently, feeling the heat radiating from her sunburned skin. "Ma'am, you're gonna cook yourself alive out here." Cordelia stirred, her green eyes fluttering open to find a stranger's weathered face inches from her own. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, framed by lines that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie winds. A mustache shadowed his upper lip and stubble darkened his angular jaw. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice cracked like autumn leaves. "Like hell you are." Oh, Maverick scooped her up before she could protest, carrying her to the shade of the nearest tree. "When's the last time you had water? Food?" She tried to remember, but couldn't. The days had blurred together since her father's death 3 weeks ago, each one a desperate battle to keep the homestead from falling to ruin. The creditors would come soon, and she had nothing left to sell except the land itself. "You live in the cabin yonder." Maverick nodded toward the weathered structure barely visible through the trees. Cordelia managed to nod, suddenly aware of how she must look, half-dressed, covered in dirt and sweat, collapsed like a broken doll in front of a stranger. Heat that had nothing to do with the sun crept up her neck. "Name's Maverick Holloway. I own the Triple H spread about 2 miles east." He pulled a canteen from his saddle and pressed it into her hands. "Drink slow." The water was cool and clean, tasting like salvation. She wanted to gulp it down, but forced herself to sip, her eyes never leaving his face. He had the kind of presence that commanded attention, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked equally capable of gentling a spooked horse or breaking a man's jaw. "Cordelia Brennan," she finally managed. "This was my father's land." Something shifted in Maverick's expression at the word was recognition, maybe, or understanding. He'd seen plenty of dreams die in this unforgiving country. "How long you been working alone out here, Miss Brennan?" The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. 3 weeks, Cordelia admitted, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. "Since the fever took Papa." Maverick's jaw tightened. He'd heard about the sickness that had swept through the valley, claiming a dozen good men in as many days. Brennan had been a stubborn old coot, but he'd been honest, which was more than could be said for most folks trying to scratch out a living in these parts. "You got family? Anyone coming to help?" She shook her head, and something in that simple gesture hit him harder than a mule's kick. He'd been alone plenty in his 34 years, but never like this, never fighting a losing battle against time and nature with nothing but determination and a woman's strength. "The banknote comes due next month," she continued, staring at her blistered hands. $400. Might as well be 4,000. Maverick studied the clearing around them, taking in the half-split woodpile, the sagging barn that needed new shingles, the garden choked with weeds. It would take 3 men a week to set things right, and that was if they knew what they were doing. What about the livestock? "Sold the cattle last week." Got enough for food through winter, if I'm careful. She pulled at the torn sleeve of her chemise, suddenly conscious of how much skin she was showing. The chickens and the milk cow are all that's left. He wanted to ask why she was killing herself for a piece of land that couldn't possibly generate $400 in a month, but he already knew the answer. This place wasn't just dirt and timber to her. It was home, memory, the last piece of her father's dreams. You ever think about taking a husband? The question slipped out before he could stop it, and he cursed himself for a fool. But Cordelia's head snapped up, her green eyes flashing with something between anger and surprise. I beg your pardon. I didn't mean... He scraped a hand through his dark hair, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy caught passing notes. Hell, that came out wrong. What I meant was, there's men in town who'd count themselves lucky to have a woman with your grit. Might solve your money troubles by trading one kind of slavery for another. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. No thank you, Mr. Holloway. I'd rather lose the land with my dignity intact. Something in her fierce independence called to him, recognizing. He'd built his own spread from nothing, working 18-hour days until his hands bled and his back screamed for mercy. The Triple H was his kingdom now. But he remembered the hunger that drove a person to keep going when every rational thought said to quit. Then we best get you some help with this woodpile, he said, rolling up his sleeves. Cordelia struggled to sit up straighter. I can't pay you. Did I ask for payment? Men don't do something for nothing. What do you want? The honest suspicion in her voice told him she'd learned that lesson the hard way. He thought about the string of suitors who'd probably come sniffing around since word got out about Brennan's death. Vultures in fancy clothes looking to snap up a vulnerable woman and her land. Maybe I want to see if that Brennan's stubbornness runs in the family, he said, picking up her fallen axe. Maybe I'm curious to see what a woman's willing to kill herself for. He swung the axe in a smooth arc, splitting a log clean down the middle. The familiar rhythm felt good after hours in the saddle, and he found himself settling into the work with an ease that surprised him. Behind him, he heard Cordelia rise unsteadily to her feet. I said, I don't need help, Cordelia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She watched Maverick work with the fluid efficiency of a man born to hard labor, his muscles moving beneath his sweat-dampened shirt like poetry written in flesh and bone. And I said, I didn't ask what you needed. Another log split cleanly, adding to the growing pile. Sometimes what we need and what we want are two different things entirely. She wanted to argue, to send him packing with his charity and his unsettling presence, but exhaustion had settled into her bones like winter cold. Instead, she found herself studying the stranger who'd appeared in her clearing like an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to speak. His hands were scarred and calloused. The hands of a man who'd never asked another soul to do his fighting. For him, when he moved, it was with the unconscious grace of someone comfortable in his own skin, confident in his place in the world. Everything about him spoke of strength held in careful check, power that could be gentle when it chose to be. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Maverick paused mid-swing, glancing at her over his shoulder. Why? Why? Help me. You don't know me from Adam's off ox, and I can't offer you anything in return. He set the axe aside and turned to face her fully, his storm gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Maybe? Because I know what it's like to fight the whole world alone. Maybe because your father once helped me out of a tight spot without asking for anything back. Papa never mentioned you. We met in town about 5 years ago. I'd gotten myself crossways with some card sharps who didn't appreciate my luck at poker. Your father stepped in when 3 of them cornered me in the alley behind Murphy's saloon. Maverick's mouth curved in a grim smile. Brendan Brennan might have been past his prime, but he still swung a mean piece of fence post. Cordelia felt a familiar ache bloom in her chest at the mention of her father's name. He'd been many things: stubborn, prideful, sometimes foolishly optimistic, but he'd never walked away from someone who needed help. He always said debts were meant to be paid, she said softly. Smart man. Maverick picked up the axe again, but didn't immediately return to work. How about this? You let me help you get caught up on the necessities, and when you're back on your feet, you can figure out how to square things between us. It was a reasonable offer, more reasonable than she had any right to expect from a stranger, but something in his tone made her pulse quicken. A suggestion of possibilities that had nothing to do with split wood or mended fences. And if I can't get back on my feet, then I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The late afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwood leaves, painting golden patterns across the clearing. Somewhere in the distance, a meadow lark called to its mate, the sound sweet and wild and full of longing. Cordelia found herself caught in the moment, suspended between the careful life she'd always known and the dangerous promise in Maverick Holloway's eyes. I should warn you, she said finally, surprising herself with a hint of teasing in her voice. Papa always said I was too stubborn for my own good. Lady, I was raised on a steady diet of stubborn. My mother could out-stubborn a Missouri mule with both hands tied behind her back. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the grief, the crushing weight of her circumstances, Cordelia felt her mouth curve in a smile. It was the first genuine smile she'd managed since her father's death, and it felt like breaking through ice into sunlight. Over the next 3 days, Maverick appeared at sunrise like clockwork, working alongside Cordelia with a quiet competence that left her both grateful and unsettled. He mended the barn roof, fixed the broken gate on the chicken coop, and split enough firewood to last her through the coming winter. But it was the smaller gestures that undid her careful defenses, the way he brought fresh bread from town. Without making it seem like charity, how he appeared with a pot of his cook's beef stew when he noticed her meager pantry. The gentle way he doctored the cuts on her hands without mentioning how they'd gotten there. You're making me soft, she accused him on the 4th morning. Finding him already at work, clearing the irrigation ditch that fed her kitchen garden, Maverick looked up from where he knelt in the mud, shirt already soaked with sweat despite the early hour. How do you figure that? 3 months ago, I would have told any man who tried to help me to go to the devil and take his charity with him. And now? Now I find myself looking forward to your arrival every morning like some simpering fool. The admission cost her, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. I don't like being beholden to anyone. He stood slowly, wiping muddy hands on his pants. Who says you're beholden? Don't play games with me, Maverick. Nothing in this world is free, and a man doesn't work like a dog for 3 days without expecting something in return. The use of his given name sent an unexpected jolt through him. She'd been calling him Mr. Holloway with careful formality, maintaining the distance between them like a shield. But now, standing in the morning sunlight with her hair gleaming like burnished copper and her chin tilted in challenge, she looked less like a desperate widow and more like the woman who'd been haunting his dreams. Maybe what I expect isn't what you think. Then tell me. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. What do you want from me, Maverick Holloway? The question hung between them like a loaded gun. He could give her the safe answer, talk about neighborly duty and repaying old debts. But something in her expression told him she was done with safe answers, done with pretty lies that protected them both from the truth. I want to know what it would feel like to kiss you, he said quietly. I want to know if you taste as sweet as you look when you're standing in morning sunlight with your guard down. I want to know what it would be like to have a woman like you choose me, not because she needs rescuing, but because she wants to. Cordelia's breath caught. She'd expected many things, but not this raw honesty that stripped away all pretense. And if I said you could find out, then I'd say you're making decisions with your heart instead of your head, And that never ends well for anyone. Maybe my head has been making decisions for too long. She reached out, her fingertips barely brushing his muddy forearm. Maybe. It's time I listened to something else for a change. The touch was electric, sending heat racing through his veins like whiskey on an empty stomach. But even as every instinct screamed at him to close the distance between them, he forced himself to step back. "You're grieving and scared and facing the loss of everything you hold dear," he said roughly. "That's not the time to make choices. You can't take back. You think I don't know my own mind? Think you're the strongest woman I've ever met. Think you deserve better than some cowboy who's taking advantage of your situation." The words were meant to protect them both. But they hit Cordelia like a physical blow. Color drained from her face, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. "I see." Her voice was carefully neutral, stripped of all emotion. "Well, I appreciate your honesty and your help. But I think it's time I stopped being a burden on your conscience." She turned to walk away, but Maverick caught her arm, spinning her back to face him. "Damn it, Cordelia, that's not what I meant, isn't it?" Fire blazed in her eyes, but he could see the hurt beneath it. "You think I'm some fragile flower who doesn't know the difference between gratitude and genuine feeling? You think I'm so? Desperate, I'd throw myself at the first man who showed me kindness." "I think you're magnificent," he said fiercely, his hands framing her face. "I think you're brave enough to face down the devil himself and too proud for your own good. I think you could have any man you wanted. And I can't figure out why you'd look twice at a broken-down cowboy who's got more scars than sense." The raw vulnerability in his voice stopped her cold. This wasn't the controlled, careful man who'd been helping her for the past 3 days. This was someone stripped bare, showing her wounds he'd probably never let anyone else see. "Broken down," she whispered. "Is that really how you see yourself?" "I see a man who's spent 34 years learning that the only person you can count on is yourself. I see someone who's made a life out of keeping people at arm's length because it's easier than risking the kind of pain that comes from caring too much." His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, "Till I met a stubborn redhead who's got me thinking. Crazy thoughts about picket fences and Sunday dinners and what it might be like to wake up next to the same woman for the next 40 years. Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs. "That sounds terrifying." "Terrifying as hell," he agreed, his mouth curving in a rueful smile. "Want to be terrified together?" She should say no. Should step back and rebuild the walls between them. Before this went any further, should remember that she barely knew this man, that her father had been dead less than a month, that she was facing financial ruin and had no business thinking about anything beyond survival. Instead, she rose up. On her toes and kissed him. It was meant to be a soft kiss, a tentative exploration. But the moment their lips met, something ignited between them that burned away all careful intentions. Maverick's arms came around her, crushing her against his chest as if he could somehow pull her inside his very skin. She tasted like morning. Coffee and wild honey. Like promises he'd never dared to make, and dreams he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Cordelia's hands were fisted in his shirt, and Maverick's forehead rested against hers as they shared the same patch of air. "This is madness," she breathed. "Complete insanity," he agreed. But he didn't let her go. "I could lose everything. We could lose everything." The correction sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with fear. We, as if they were already a unit. Already bound together by something stronger than circumstances. "The banknote? We'll figure something out." His voice was steady, sure. "Together? You don't understand. $400 is I've got $400. The words dropped between them like stones in still water, creating ripples. That changed everything. Cordelia pulled back, studying his face with new eyes. "You'd do that?" Pay my debts. Our debts, he corrected again. If you'll have me. The proposal hung unspoken between them, but it was there in his eyes, in the way. He held her as if she were something precious and fragile, and absolutely essential to his continued existence. Are you asking me to marry you, Maverick Holloway? I'm asking you to take a chance on a man who's never wanted anything as much as he wants you. I'm asking you to build something with me that neither of us could build alone. His hands tightened on her waist. I'm asking you to let me shoulder this with you, for real this time. All of it. Forever. Cordelia stared at him, her mind reeling. You can't possibly mean that. You've known me for 4 days. I've known enough women in my time to recognize something real when I see it. Maverick's voice was steady, but she could feel the tension coiled in his body. I know you're loyal and hardworking and too stubborn to quit when any sensible person would walk away. I know you loved your father enough to work yourself to death trying to save his dream. I know you've got enough fire in you to burn down half the territory when you're riled, and enough gentleness to doctor a stranger's hands without being asked. That's not enough to build a marriage on, isn't it? Half the couples in town married for less. Convenience, loneliness, or just because their families thought it was a good match. He stepped closer again, his eyes never leaving hers, at least. We've got honest attraction and mutual respect to start with. And what happens when the attraction fades? When you realize you've saddled yourself with a woman who comes with nothing but debts and dreams, then I guess we'll find out what we're cut. We've really made of courage. His smile was soft, almost tender. But I'm betting we're made of stronger stuff than either of us knows. Before she could respond, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the clearing. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their faces hard in purpose, clear in their bearing. Cordelia's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Silas Crow, the banker who held her father's note. Miss Brennan, Crow called out, dismounting with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to being feared. I've come to discuss your father's obligations. Maverick shifted slightly, positioning himself between Cordelia and the newcomers. She noticed his hand drift toward the gun on his hip, the movement so subtle it was almost unconscious. Mr. Crow, she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. The note isn't due for another 3 weeks. Circumstances change. Crow's pale eyes flicked to Maverick with obvious disdain. I've had an offer on this property that's generous enough to clear your debt and leave you a small sum besides. Enough to start fresh somewhere else. This land isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Girl, and you're hardly in a position to be particular. His gaze lingered on her torn dress and disheveled appearance with calculated insult. Though perhaps you've found other ways too. Negotiate your circumstances. The words hung in the air like a curse. Maverick went very still beside her, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. When he spoke, his voice was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. You'll want to be real careful how you finish that thought, Crow. And you'll want to mind your own business, Holloway. This is between me and the girl. The lady, Maverick corrected, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. And anything concerning her concerns me. Crow laughed, but the sound held no humor. Planning to marry into debt, are you? That's not very practical, even for you. As a matter of fact, Cordelia said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, we are planning to marry. And my husband will be handling my financial affairs from now on. The lie rolled off her tongue as smooth as honey, but she felt Maverick's sharp look. To his credit, he didn't contradict her, just moved closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Is that so? Crow's smile was cold as winter. Well then, congratulations. I'm sure you'll both be very happy in whatever shack you can afford after I foreclose on this place. There won't be a foreclosure, Maverick said quietly. The debt will be paid in full before the note comes due. With what money? Unless you've struck gold somewhere I haven't heard about. You don't have $400 any more than she does. Try me. Something in Maverick's tone made Crow's confident expression falter. The banker's eyes narrowed as he studied the cowboy with new interest, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You're bluffing, am I? Maverick's smile was all edges, only one way to find out. The standoff stretched between the men like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Cordelia could feel the danger crackling in the air, the kind of tension that came before gunfire and bloodshed. But before anyone could make a move they'd all regret, she stepped forward, placing herself squarely between Maverick and Crow. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from having nothing left to lose. Let me make something perfectly clear. This is my land, bought and paid for with my father's blood and sweat. It will remain my land, whether as Cordelia Brennan or— she glanced at Maverick, drawing strength from his steady presence— or as Cordelia Holloway. Crow's face darkened. Fine words, but they don't change the facts. $400 due in full in 3 weeks, or I start foreclosure proceedings. And you'll have your money, Maverick said, never taking his eyes off the banker. Every penny, with interest. But after that, you'll stay off this property and away from my wife. Are we clear? Crystal. Crow remounted his horse with sharp, angry movements. But don't think this is over, Holloway. Men who reach above their station have a way of falling hard. I'll keep that in mind, Maverick replied mildly. But his hand never left his gun. The 3 riders wheeled their horses and departed as quickly as they'd come, leaving dust and unspoken threats hanging in the air. Only when they'd disappeared into the trees did Cordelia allow herself to breathe again. Well, she said, turning to face Maverick with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. I suppose we're engaged now. I suppose we are. His expression was unreadable. Question is, are you planning to go through with it, or was that just for Crow's benefit? The honest question deserved an honest answer. But Cordelia found herself struggling with the magnitude of what she was considering. Marriage to a man she'd known for 4 days, trading her independence for protection, letting someone else fight. Her battles, ... I don't know, she admitted. Everything's happening so fast. Then we slow it down. Maverick removed his hat, running his fingers through his dark hair. We court properly, take time to get to know each other. The offer stands. I'll pay the debt regardless. You can pay me back over time, or we can call it a wedding gift if things work out between us. And if they don't work out, then you'll own your land free and clear, and I'll have the satisfaction of knowing I helped someone worth helping. The generosity in his offer took her breath away. In her experience, men didn't make gestures like that without expecting something substantial in return. But looking into Maverick's storm-gray eyes, she saw only sincerity and a patience that spoke of deep waters. You're not what I expected when I prayed for help, she said softly. What did you expect? A miracle, I suppose. Some impossible salvation that would let me keep everything exactly as it was. She smiled ruefully. I never considered that salvation might come with complications. It's the best things usually do. He stepped closer, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. So what do you say, Cordelia Brennan? Are you willing to let this particular complication court you properly? She thought of her father, who'd always said that life was meant to be lived boldly. She thought of the long, lonely years stretching ahead if she tried to face the world alone. Mostly, she thought of the way Maverick looked at her, not as a burden or a convenience, but as a woman worth fighting for. I suppose I could allow it, she said, unable to suppress her smile. But I should warn you, I don't court easy. Lady, he said, leaning down until his lips barely brushed hers. I wouldn't have you any other way. 6 months later, as autumn painted the cottonwoods gold and crimson, Cordelia Holloway stood in the doorway of what was now their cabin, watching her husband repair the very fence where they'd first met. The land was thriving under their combined efforts, the debt long since paid, and their love had grown from desperate attraction into something deep and enduring. When Maverick looked up and caught her watching him, his answering smile was everything she'd never dared to hope for: partnership, passion, and the promise of all their tomorrows stretching ahead like an endless prairie under a boundless sky. Sometimes salvation came exactly as expected, but sometimes, if you were very lucky, it came as something infinitely better, a love worth shouldering together, whatever storms might come.